I'm 28 years old, male, and until a few months ago, I thought my father was a distant memory from a long, painful chapter of my childhood. He walked out when I was 10. I remember the day clearly, my mother sitting on the living room floor, phone clutched in her hand, trying to hold back tears as she explained that he was going away for a while. That while turned into almost 2 decades of silence. No phone calls, no birthday cards, no attempts to reach out, just a gaping absence that left my mom to fend for us both. I grew up watching her work multiple jobs to keep us afloat. She'd take on late-night shifts, often coming home exhausted but still managing a smile for me. We didn't have much, but she made sure I never felt the lack. Despite everything, I pushed through. I worked hard, built a successful career, and recently inherited a sizable sum from my maternal grandparents. This inheritance allowed me to buy a condo, start my own business, and finally take a breath after years of grinding. Life was good, or so I thought. Then, out of nowhere, I get a message on social media. It was him. My father, who hadn't contacted me once in 18 years, suddenly popped up in my DMs like it was the most natural thing in the world. He started off with, "Hey, I know it's been a while, but I've been thinking about you a lot lately. I'd love to reconnect if you're open to it." My initial reaction was shock, then anger. Why now? Why, after all these years of radio silence, does he want to reconnect? The timing felt way too convenient, especially since I'd just posted about my recent business success and the new condo on my social media. I took a screenshot and sent it to my mom. Her reply was immediate: "Be careful. I don't trust this." Neither did I, but I decided to play along for a bit, just to see where this was going. He suggested meeting for coffee, and against my better judgment, I agreed. The meeting was awkward from the start. He looked older, obviously, but still carried himself with the same false confidence I vaguely remembered. He hugged me like we were old friends, but it felt stiff, like he was acting for an audience that wasn't there. We sat down, and the small talk began: how I'd been, what I was up to, how proud he was of me. He threw in a few anecdotes from my childhood, trying to remind me of the good times, but all I could think about were the times he wasn't there. The conversation quickly took a turn when he mentioned he'd fallen on hard times. He talked about losing his job, about how tough things had been, and how he was just trying to get back on his feet. It was subtle, but I could feel the angle he was working. There was no apology for leaving us, no acknowledgement of the years of hardship he'd caused, just a lot of vague excuses about how he thought it was better for everyone if he stayed away. I didn't buy it for a second. He even started asking weirdly specific questions about my business, how it was going, what kind of revenue we were generating, if I was thinking of expanding. It felt more like a job interview than a catch-up between father and son. The whole time, I couldn't shake the feeling that he'd been stalking my social media for a while. He mentioned a few things I'd posted over the past year, which made me realize he probably knew more about my life than I was comfortable with. When I got home, I called my mom to give her a recap. She listened quietly and then said, "I had a feeling he'd show up sooner or later. He's probably heard about the inheritance." Her words hit me hard. She explained that she'd dealt with him pulling this kind of stunt before. Apparently, right after they split up, he borrowed money from her sister and never paid it back. He'd show up, act friendly and apologetic, and then disappear once he got what he wanted. The next day, I noticed he'd started following me on all my social media accounts. He left a comment on one of my recent posts about the condo. "Looks amazing, son. Can't wait to see it in person." It was jarring. This man, who hadn't even known where I lived for almost 2 decades, was now acting like a proud, supportive dad. The love bombing had begun, and it felt as fake as it looked. Over the next few days, his messages became more frequent. He'd send random "I miss you" texts and long paragraphs about how much he regretted not being around. At one point, he even offered to help out with my business if I ever needed an extra hand. This was coming from a guy who'd never shown any interest in what I did for a living before. It was so transparent that I almost laughed. He was trying to worm his way into my life, and it was painfully obvious. My mom and I had a long talk that night. She didn't hold back this time, sharing details I hadn't known about before, the debts he left behind, the lies he told to borrow money from family, and the way he'd manipulate people until they finally cut him off. She told me to be careful, to protect myself and my finances. I could tell she was worried, and it only reinforced what I already knew. He wasn't here for me. He was here for what he thought he could get from me. I ended up blocking him on social media that night, needing some space to think. He didn't take it well. The calls and texts started coming in from unknown numbers, voicemails filled with everything from pleas for a second chance to passive-aggressive digs about me being cold-hearted. This was just the beginning. I knew I had to figure out what his real game was before he could do any more damage. Update 1. So after that weird first meeting, I couldn't shake the feeling that my father's sudden reappearance was about more than just reconnecting. It didn't help that he was blowing up my phone with messages about how much he missed me. Every text had some over-the-top sentiment: "I'm so proud of the man you've become, and I've dreamed of this day for years." It all felt so fake, like he was trying way too hard. I decided to test him. I came up with this plan on a whim while talking to my mom. I told her I was going to mention a fake investment opportunity to see how he'd react. She wasn't surprised. In fact, she seemed relieved that I was being cautious. "If he takes the bait, at least you'll know what he's really after," she said. The next time he called, I brought it up casually. I told him about this amazing investment I'd heard about, a new tech startup that was supposedly going to take off. I made sure to frame it as risky, but with a huge potential payoff. His reaction was instant. He went from reminiscing about old times to full-on business mode. He wanted to know everything: how much I was planning to put in, what kind of return I expected, and when I was planning to invest. He was practically drooling over the idea. I hadn't even finished explaining my made-up pitch when he interrupted with, we should do this together. It would be a great father-son bonding experience. He kept pushing the idea of us pooling our money. It was like he'd forgotten that we hadn't spoken in 18 years. He was acting like we were best friends planning a weekend trip. The whole thing screamed red flag to me. If there was any doubt before, it was gone now. Later that night, I sat down with my mom to talk about everything. That's when she decided it was time to tell me more about his past. I knew he'd left us in a bad spot, but I had no idea how deep it really went. She started from the beginning, sharing stories I'd never heard before, how he'd maxed out her credit cards, took out loans in her name, and even borrowed money from her sister without ever paying it back. Apparently, he had a gambling problem, one that cost us everything. He left us drowning in debt, she said. I had to take on 3 jobs just to keep the lights on after he disappeared. I could see the anger and hurt in her eyes, emotions she'd kept hidden from me for years. It was clear now why she'd been so wary when he reached out. This wasn't just about reconnecting. It was about him trying to dig himself out of another financial mess, using me as his lifeline. Armed with this new information, I decided it was time to confront him. I called him up the next day and went straight for it. I asked why he was really here after all this time and brought up the fake investment again. I pressed him about his sudden interest in my life, why he was asking so many questions about my business, and why he'd never tried to contact me before now. He immediately went on the defensive. He dodged every question and started guilt-tripping me instead. He talked about how hard it was for him to stay away, how he thought it was best for everyone if he kept his distance, and how he missed my first steps and all these moments he supposedly regrets missing. He wasn't apologizing, he was trying to flip the script. He kept saying things like family should support each other, and how I needed to show a little compassion. It was infuriating. He wanted me to feel guilty for not trusting him, when he was the one who'd left us in ruins. After that call, I blocked him on social media. I needed space to think, and I wasn't about to keep dealing with his constant messages. It didn't take long for him to escalate. Within hours, I started getting calls from unknown numbers. Voicemail after voicemail, each one more desperate than the last. He was swinging between apologizing and making demands. One message was him crying, saying he needed help, and the next was him angrily accusing me of abandoning him. Then came the kicker. In one of the voicemails, he finally admitted what I'd been expecting all along. He needed a small loan. He tried to play it off as no big deal, like it was just a temporary thing to help him get back on his feet. He even promised he'd pay me back as soon as things turn around. I almost laughed when I heard it. This was exactly what my mom had warned me about. He hadn't changed at all. I decided I was done playing his games. I called him back one last time and gave him an ultimatum. I told him flat out, I'm not giving you any money. If you're serious about rebuilding a relationship, you need to prove it with actions, not words. No more manipulation, no more guilt trips. If you want a second chance, you have to earn it. He tried to interrupt, but I didn't let him. I made it clear that I wasn't going to be his next victim. If he couldn't accept that, then we had nothing more to talk about. He went silent for a moment, then hung up on me without saying another word. I haven't heard from him directly since that call, but I know this isn't the end. He's the type who doesn't give up easily, especially when there's money involved. For now, I'm keeping my guard up and preparing for whatever he tries next. This was just the beginning, and I have a feeling things are going to get worse before they get better. Update 2. After our last call, I thought I'd finally put an end to my father's manipulations, but things only got worse from there. He didn't take my ultimatum well. Instead of backing off, his behavior became even more erratic. He was calling me nonstop from unknown numbers, leaving long voicemails alternating between begging for a loan and ranting about how ungrateful I was. It was exhausting, and I knew I needed help if I was going to handle this. I decided it was time to reach out to my extended family, his side of the family, specifically. I hadn't been in contact with them much over the years. My mom kept her distance from his relatives after he left, and as a kid, I didn't have much say in the matter. But now I figured they might have some insight. Maybe they could confirm if this was a pattern of his or if I was overreacting. I started with my aunt, his older sister. I tracked down her number and gave her a call. To my surprise, she wasn't shocked at all when I told her what was happening. Instead, she sounded resigned, like she'd been through this before. She told me she hadn't heard from my father in years, but when he did pop up, it was always because he needed something, usually money. Apparently, he'd borrowed a significant sum from her years ago and never paid it back. Encouraged by this conversation, I called 2 of my uncles next. They told similar stories. One of them said my father had convinced him to co-sign a loan, promising it was just a temporary situation. When he defaulted, my uncle was left paying off the debt. The more I listened, the more it became clear my father had been pulling this same scam on different family members for decades. He'd show up when someone came into money, play the part of the concerned relative, and then disappear as soon as he got what he wanted. I knew I needed to gather evidence before things escalated even more. I spent the next couple of days compiling everything I had, the voicemails, screenshots of his texts, and a log of all the unknown numbers he'd called from. I wanted a clear record in case this turned into a legal battle. My father must have caught wind that I was talking to the family because he started pushing back hard. He called me in a rage, accusing me of turning everyone against him. He played the victim, saying I was ruining his life, and that all he wanted was to rebuild a relationship with his only son. It was the same manipulative tactics all over again, and I wasn't falling for it. I spoke with my aunt again, and she suggested we have a family meeting. She wanted to confront him together so he couldn't twist the narrative. I wasn't sure it would work, but I agreed. We set a date and decided to meet at my uncle's house, a neutral place where he'd have no power to control the situation. The day of the meeting, I walked in with a sense of dread, but also determination. The room was tense, with a few of my aunts and uncles exchanging worried looks. When my father showed up, he was all smiles, acting like he was happy to see everyone. It was almost impressive how quickly he slipped into the role of the misunderstood victim. He started off with a speech about how he'd made mistakes but was trying to make amends. It was pure theatrics. Then my uncle cut him off. He brought up the loan my father never repaid, demanding to know why he'd never bothered to make things right. My father's smile faltered, but he still tried to laugh it off, saying it was all a misunderstanding. My aunt wasn't having it either. She brought up how he'd borrowed money from her too, promising it was for an emergency, but then used it to gamble. Things escalated quickly after that. The room turned into a full-blown intervention, with family members throwing accusation after accusation at him. He denied everything, acting shocked and hurt, saying he couldn't believe they'd accuse him of such things. He tried to deflect, bringing up my childhood again, talking about how he'd missed my first steps and how hard it was for him to stay away. It was classic emotional manipulation, but this time, it wasn't working. One of my uncles, the quietest one in the room, finally spoke up. He reminded everyone of a specific incident from years ago when my father had stolen a valuable watch from their father's estate. It was something my father couldn't refute because there were witnesses back then. His face turned red, and he couldn't come up with a response. Realizing he was cornered, he snapped. He started yelling about how he didn't need this kind of treatment from his own family, that we were all ganging up on him. He stormed out of the house, slamming the door behind him. Within hours of leaving the meeting, he was back at it, bombarding me with texts. They ranged from angry outbursts to long, rambling apologies. He was swinging wildly between playing the victim and trying to guilt-trip me. It was overwhelming, so I blocked him on every platform again. I needed a break, and I couldn't deal with his constant barrage of messages. I decided it was time to get some legal advice. I was worried he might actually try something drastic, like going after part of my inheritance. I found a lawyer who specialized in family disputes and laid everything out for her. She told me I was doing the right thing by documenting everything and blocking him. She also advised me to be prepared for him to keep creating new social media accounts to contact me. Sure enough, a couple of days later, I got a notification from a new account he'd made. He was posting publicly now, accusing me of being a selfish son who refused to help his own father in his time of need. The comments were brutal, with him painting me as this greedy, heartless person. I'd had enough. I made my own post on Reddit, laying out the entire situation in detail. I included screenshots redacting names for privacy, and shared the whole story from start to finish. The response was immediate, thousands of comments, messages of support, and people who'd been through similar situations sharing their experiences. It was a relief to finally have my side of the story out there, and it helped to know I wasn't alone in dealing with someone like him. But I knew this was just the beginning. My father wasn't going to give up easily, and I had a feeling things were about to get even more chaotic. Update 3. After I posted my story on Reddit, it blew up overnight. I woke up to thousands of comments and messages. People from all over were sharing their own similar experiences and offering advice. Some of the responses were heartbreaking, stories about manipulative parents, estranged family members resurfacing only for money, and people getting caught in the same cycle of guilt and emotional blackmail. It was overwhelming but validating. I wasn't crazy, this was a real pattern of behavior and others had been through it too. But just as I started feeling some relief, things took a sharp turn. Somehow, my father found the Reddit post. I don't know if someone showed it to him or if he was actively stalking my online activity, but he saw it. I got an email from him, long, rambling, and filled with anger. He accused me of airing dirty laundry for the whole world to see. He called me a liar, said I was making him look bad, and then he dropped a bombshell. He was threatening legal action. The email claimed he was entitled to part of my inheritance due to family obligations and an implied trust. He said that as my father, he had a right to a portion of whatever I'd inherited from my grandparents. I knew it was nonsense, but the way he framed it, it sounded almost convincing. He ended the email by warning me that if I didn't settle this privately, he'd take me to court. I was rattled. I called my lawyer immediately, explaining the situation and forwarding her the email. She assured me it was nothing but a scare tactic. There's no legal basis for what he was claiming, especially since the inheritance was specifically from my mom's side of the family. Still, she advised me to keep documenting everything just in case he tried something. As if the legal threats weren't enough, he took to social media with a new round of posts. He was posting vague, passive-aggressive messages on his new accounts, talking about how he was being betrayed by the people he loved the most. He never mentioned my name directly, but it was obvious who he was talking about. He was playing the victim for his small circle of followers, painting me as this selfish, cold-hearted son who was turning his back on his own father. The worst part was, a few distant relatives started reaching out to me, buying into his narrative. They'd seen his posts and were messaging me, saying things like, maybe you should give him a second chance, and he's still your dad, no matter what. It was frustrating to deal with, especially since they didn't know the full story or the history of what he'd done. In the middle of all this chaos, one of my uncles reached out to me privately. He told me something I hadn't heard before. My father had recently tried to scam another family member out of their retirement savings. He'd come up with some fake business venture, promising huge returns, and almost convinced them to invest. Thankfully, they got suspicious and backed out at the last minute. My uncle wanted me to know so I could be extra careful. It was just more proof that he hadn't changed at all. Then, things got even messier. I started getting calls from debt collectors, several of them. They were looking for my father, asking if I knew how to contact him, or if he lived with me. It was clear he'd either listed me as a reference or used my address without my permission. I explained the situation to the collectors, telling them I hadn't seen him in nearly 2 decades before this year, but the calls kept coming. My mom called me a few days later with more bad news. She'd been contacted by an old friend of my father's. Apparently, he'd been bragging about his plan to get money out of me, claiming it was his right as my father. The friend warned her that he was in deep with some dangerous people due to unpaid debts. It was starting to sound like he was desperate, maybe even panicking. I doubled down on gathering evidence, compiling all the voicemails, screenshots, and texts. I couldn't afford to let my guard down now. My lawyer agreed it was time to take action, so she drafted a cease and desist letter. We sent it to him, making it clear that if he didn't stop contacting me and making false claims, we'd pursue legal consequences. While all this was going on, I received an unexpected message from an anonymous account. The person claimed they knew my father and warned me to be careful. They said he was in over his head with some very bad people, and that he was trying to use me as a last-ditch effort to bail himself out. I didn't know if I could trust the message, but it lined up with everything else I'd been hearing. Then came the final twist. I got a phone call from a number I didn't recognize. It was one of my father's ex-wives, someone I'd never even heard of before. She told me she'd seen his recent social media posts and felt compelled to reach out. According to her, he'd used the exact same tactics on her and her family years ago: love bombing, guilt trips, and then financial demands. She said he'd drained her savings and left her in debt before vanishing. She apologized for not reaching out sooner, but she didn't know how to find me before. With all this new information, I felt more certain than ever that I was doing the right thing. I sent everything I'd collected to my lawyer, and we decided to escalate. The cease and desist was just the first step. If he didn't back off, we were ready to file for a restraining order. I haven't heard back from him directly since we sent the letter, but I'm not holding my breath. He's not the type to give up easily, especially not when he's this desperate. I'm bracing myself for whatever comes next, but at least now I have the support of my family and the online community. For the first time, I feel like I'm not fighting this battle alone. Update 4. I thought things were calming down after sending the cease and desist letter, but I was wrong. One night, I was sitting in my living room when I heard loud banging at my front door. It was around 9 p.m. and I wasn't expecting anyone. I checked the peephole, and there he was, my father, standing outside my condo, looking furious. He was shouting my name, demanding I let him in so we could talk this out. I felt a wave of panic. He wasn't supposed to know where I lived. I quickly dialed 911. I didn't want to confront him directly. His behavior was erratic, and I had no idea what he was capable of. The dispatcher assured me that officers were on their way. I stayed on the line, trying to keep my voice low while he continued pounding on the door, yelling about how I was ruining his life and how I needed to stop lying about him online. He must have found the Reddit post and realized how many people now knew the truth. The police arrived within minutes. They asked him to leave, giving him a formal warning not to come back. He tried to argue with them, insisting he was just here to see his son, but they weren't having it. They escorted him off the property, and I watched from my window as he stormed away, still shouting about how I was tearing the family apart. The officers advised me to upgrade my security and document everything, just in case this escalated further. The next day, I took their advice. I installed cameras around the condo and got a better alarm system. I also informed my building's security team about what happened and gave them a photo of my father, instructing them not to let him in if he showed up again. It was a strange feeling, having to take these precautions against my own dad, but I couldn't risk ignoring the warning signs anymore. The word spread quickly through the family. I started getting texts from a few relatives who hadn't been involved up to this point. They accused me of overreacting, saying things like, "You should have just talked to him, and he's your father after all." It was frustrating. These were people who had no idea what I'd been dealing with, yet they were quick to judge. I felt isolated, like I was the villain in a story he'd crafted to paint himself as the victim. That's when I decided I'd had enough. I was done being quiet. I posted a follow-up on Reddit, detailing everything that had happened since my original post. I included screenshots of his texts and voicemails with personal details redacted, showing his manipulative behavior. I also shared the story of him showing up unannounced and the police getting involved. The response was overwhelming. People rallied behind me, validating what I'd experienced and offering advice on how to protect myself going forward. My father must have seen the update because he lost it. He started posting on his own social media accounts, calling me a lying gold digger and claiming I was making up stories to destroy his reputation. He tagged a bunch of our family members in the posts, trying to rally them to his side. It was bizarre to watch him unravel publicly like this. He was throwing everything he could at the wall, hoping something would stick. But then something unexpected happened. Internet detectives got involved. Reddit users started digging into his online presence, finding old public records of his bankruptcies, multiple failed business ventures, and even a few lawsuits filed against him. They posted the findings in the comments of my update, and it was like the final piece of the puzzle. His entire narrative crumbled, and people started to see through the facade. The support I got was incredible. Lawyers, financial advisors, and even therapists chimed in, offering their professional opinions and advice. One lawyer messaged me privately, suggesting I look into filing a harassment lawsuit if he didn't back off. I forwarded this to my own lawyer, who agreed and began preparing the paperwork. A few days later, I got a desperate email from my father. It was a long, rambling message filled with claims about how he was being hunted down by dangerous people because of his debts. He said I was his last hope and begged me for money one final time. It was clear now that he wasn't just broke, he was in serious trouble. But I didn't respond. I blocked his email address and asked my lawyer to move forward with a restraining order if he tried contacting me again. After blocking him everywhere, I felt a small sense of relief. My mom called me to check in, and I could hear the relief in her voice too. She told me she'd been dealing with his manipulation privately for years, always worrying about when he might try to pull me into his mess. We talked for a long time that night, and it felt like a weight was lifting off both of us. In the days following, a few of the relatives who had initially sided with him reached out to apologize. They'd seen the evidence I shared online and admitted they'd been misled. It was a small victory, but it meant a lot to know that not everyone believed his lies. Just when I thought things were settling down, a mutual family friend contacted me. My father had tried reaching out through them, saying he was desperate to speak with me. The friend immediately warned me, telling me it seemed like more manipulation. I thanked them and made it clear I wasn't interested in any more contact. In my next therapy session, I talked through everything that had happened. My therapist pointed out that I'd been carrying the burden of my father's actions for years, even when I wasn't aware of it. She helped me see that I wasn't responsible for his choices or his situation, and for the first time, I started to believe it. I don't know what my father's next move will be, but I'm finally starting to feel some closure. I'm prepared for whatever comes next, but I'm also ready to move on. For the first time in a long time, it feels like I'm regaining control of my own life. Update 5. It's been a whirlwind since I last posted. I have a lot to share, and I want to start by thanking everyone who has supported me throughout this. Your comments, messages, and advice have been invaluable. I've taken major steps to protect myself and finally feel like I'm on the other side of this mess. First off, I'm relieved to say the restraining order has been granted. It was a straightforward process given all the evidence I had collected: texts, voicemails, social media posts, and even footage from the night he showed up at my condo. My lawyer was confident, and the judge agreed. He can no longer legally contact me, and if he tries anything, he'll face serious consequences. It's a huge weight off my shoulders. With that settled, I took the next logical step and updated my will. I'd always put it off, figuring I was too young to worry about that kind of thing. But this experience made me realize how important it is to have everything in order. I worked with a financial advisor to set up a trust that ensures my inheritance is protected. If anything happens to me, the money goes directly into a trust for future charitable causes. This way, there's no loophole for my father, or anyone else, for that matter, to exploit. During one of our meetings, my financial advisor also helped me put additional safeguards in place. We restructured some of my assets and added legal protections to my business accounts. It's comforting to know that I'm secure now, and any future attempts to claim a part of my inheritance will be dead on arrival. After getting the legalities sorted, I decided to post a final update on Reddit. I wanted to share the good news and thank everyone who had been there for me. The response was overwhelming. People who had followed my story from the beginning commented, expressing relief and happiness that I was finally finding some peace. Many shared how my story had helped them set boundaries in their own lives, which was something I hadn't expected but was deeply grateful for. Since the restraining order, my father has gone completely silent. I haven't heard from him directly, but through the grapevine, I found out he left town. Some old family friends mentioned he's trying to avoid legal troubles and might be moving around to avoid debt collectors. I'm not surprised, but it's still strange to think he's out there somewhere, hopefully realizing that he can't manipulate his way out of this one. In the meantime, I've been focusing on healing and repairing relationships with family members who were initially manipulated by him. A few of them reached out, apologizing for not believing me earlier. We had some tough but honest conversations, and I'm glad to say that we're on better terms now. It's been nice to reconnect without the cloud of his influence hanging over us. Therapy has been a big part of my recovery process. I've kept up with my sessions, and they've made a huge difference. My therapist pointed out that I'd been carrying the weight of my father's actions for years, even when I wasn't directly in contact with him. The guilt, the fear of becoming like him, it was all there, buried deep. Working through that has been hard, but I'm finally starting to feel lighter. I'm learning to forgive myself for things I had no control over. One of the best parts of this journey has been reconnecting with my mom. This whole ordeal brought us closer together, and we decided to take a trip, a long overdue vacation. We went to a quiet beach town, just the two of us, and spent a week relaxing, talking, and just enjoying each other's company. It was the first time in years that we both felt truly at peace, like we could finally breathe again. Business-wise, things have been going great. I landed a couple of big deals recently, and I feel more secure knowing I've put all the necessary protections in place. I've got a good team around me, and we're planning some exciting expansions. For the first time in a while, I'm looking forward to the future without that nagging fear in the back of my mind. I was approached by a podcast about family dynamics and manipulative relationships. They asked if I'd be willing to share my story anonymously, and I agreed. It was nerve-wracking at first, but it ended up being therapeutic. I realized that by sharing my experience, I might help others who are going through similar situations. It felt good to turn something so negative into a chance to support others. A surprising moment came when I received a letter from one of my father's ex-wives. I didn't even know she existed until recently. The letter was kind. She apologized for not reaching out sooner and offered her support if I ever needed it. She shared some of her own experiences with my father, confirming everything I'd suspected. It was validating, but also sad to see the same pattern repeated with others. As part of my healing, I've set firm boundaries with the entire family. I've made it clear that I won't tolerate any attempts to contact me on behalf of my father. If anyone tries, they're cut off immediately. It sounds harsh, but I've learned the hard way that boundaries are crucial. In my final therapy session, I talked about everything that's happened. For the first time, I didn't feel the familiar tightness in my chest when discussing my father. Instead, I felt a sense of closure. I've done everything I can to protect myself, and now I'm ready to move forward. I'm excited about a new business venture I'm starting soon, something I've been dreaming about for years but never felt secure enough to pursue. It feels like a fresh start, and I'm diving in headfirst, confident in the knowledge that I've set myself up for success. To everyone who followed my journey on Reddit, thank you. Your support has meant more to me than words can express. I'm signing off now, ready to put this chapter behind me and look toward a brighter future. I've learned so much about self-worth, boundaries, and the importance of protecting my own peace. Goodbye, Reddit. Here's to new beginnings and the freedom that comes with finally letting go. I'm a 27-year-old guy, and until recently, I thought my family was normal. We weren't perfect, but we were close. My dad, 59, was a well-respected man in our community, a businessman who built his company from the ground up. He was the kind of person people looked up to, charismatic, successful, and seemingly devoted to his family. When he passed away unexpectedly from a heart attack, it felt like the world had been pulled out from under me. The days leading up to the funeral were a blur. My mom, my siblings, and I were overwhelmed with everything. The arrangements, the condolences, the sheer weight of losing him. The turnout was expected to be big. He had business partners, lifelong friends, and extended family members who would all be there. We wanted to make sure it was a respectful, dignified service. But even before the funeral started, something felt off. Some of our relatives were acting weird, whispering among themselves, giving my mom these strange looks. At first, I thought it was just the stress of the situation. People react differently to grief, right? But then I caught snippets of conversation. Did they know? Not the time to say anything. She's actually here. None of it made sense. I chalked it up to people gossiping about business drama or some old family grudge. I didn't have time to worry about it. I was too busy making sure my mom wasn't completely breaking down. She and my dad had been together for over 30 years. This loss had crushed her. Then right before the service started, a group of strangers walked in. A woman and 3 teenagers. They stood at the back of the room, awkward and uncertain, like they weren't sure if they were supposed to be there. I had never seen them before, but something about them felt familiar. My mom saw them too. She went pale, gripping the side of her chair so hard her knuckles turned white. My aunt, her sister, rushed over, whispering something urgently in her ear. That's when everything fell apart. The woman stepped forward. People started turning, whispering. She hesitated for a moment, then walked straight toward us. She looked nervous, like she knew what was about to happen wasn't going to go over well. She introduced herself. She said she was my father's other wife, and the teenagers, my dad's other kids. At first, I thought I misheard her. Maybe she meant she was some kind of distant cousin, or a former business partner, anything but what she actually said. But then the room erupted. Gasps, murmurs, stares. I felt like I had been punched in the stomach. My mom? She broke. She started crying, right there in front of everyone. Some of our family members rushed to comfort her, while others avoided eye contact. That's when I realized some had known for years, while others were just as blindsided as we were, creating an awkward divide. I demanded an explanation. The woman, let's call her Lisa, looked torn between guilt and defiance. She didn't back down. She pulled out her phone and started showing proof. Photos, screenshots of texts, financial records showing my dad had been supporting her and her kids for years. Years. This wasn't some recent affair. This wasn't a mistake. This was a full-blown second life. The funeral turned into chaos. Guests were whispering. Some were openly gawking. Others tried to pretend like they weren't listening. I heard someone say, "I knew it," like this was some open secret I had somehow missed. And then a man in a suit stepped forward. A lawyer. He asked to speak with my family privately. Apparently, there were complications with my dad's will. At that point, I couldn't even process what was happening. My father had just died, and suddenly I was finding out he had an entire other family. And now there were legal issues. My mind was spinning, but I followed the lawyer into another room with my mom and siblings, leaving the funeral in disarray behind us. Inside, the lawyer laid it out for us. My dad's estate wasn't going to be as straightforward as we thought. There were assets, houses, investments, money that were potentially tied up with Lisa and her kids, and they weren't just here to mourn. They expected to be included. I felt like I was in a nightmare. I stormed back into the funeral hall and confronted Lisa. How long had she known? Did she know about us? Did my dad ever plan to tell us? She looked genuinely sad but held her ground. Lisa admitted she had initially believed my father was divorced, but over the years she started to realize the truth. By the time she knew he was still married, she was already deeply involved and had chosen to stay silent, that he had planned to tell us one day. One day, like that made it better, like it changed anything. Meanwhile, my mom was still crying, humiliated in front of everyone, our relatives, our friends, even his business partners. This wasn't just a betrayal, it was a public spectacle. And then Lisa dropped the final bombshell. Her kids, my dad's other kids, wanted to be a part of our lives moving forward. I didn't even have words for that. The funeral was officially ruined. People started leaving. Some came up to awkwardly give their condolences, clearly not sure what to say anymore. Others just avoided eye contact and rushed out. I barely remember the rest of the night. I just know that by the time we left, nothing in my life would ever be the same again. The day after the funeral, my mother, my siblings, and I met with our lawyer to go over my father's will. After everything that had just happened, we weren't sure what to expect, but we assumed it would be a straightforward division of assets. My dad had always been a planner, the kind of man who kept things organized. At least, that's what we thought. The meeting started off normal enough. The lawyer went over the basics, bank accounts, properties, business holdings, but then he got to the real estate section, and everything stopped. A significant portion of my dad's assets, including a second home, was left to Lisa and her kids. My mother didn't say anything at first. She just stared at the papers, gripping the armrest of her chair so tightly that her fingers turned white. Then she demanded to know if the will had been tampered with. The lawyer shook his head. Everything was legal, properly filed. My dad had made sure of that. My mother exploded. She wanted an investigation into whether he had altered their finances without her knowledge. She had been married to him for over 30 years. She had run their household, raised his children, been by his side through everything. And now, things only got worse from there. After the meeting, a longtime friend of my dad's pulled me aside. He looked uncomfortable, hesitant, like he didn't want to be the one to say what he was about to say, but he told me anyway. He had known about Lisa and the second family for years. My dad had confided in him, sworn him to secrecy. He claimed he had always meant to come clean, but never found the right time. I barely had time to process that before my uncle, my dad's own brother, admitted the same thing. My uncle had known too. He tried to justify it, saying my father had been afraid of losing us, that he had been torn, that he had just been trying to do the right thing for everyone. It didn't feel like the right thing. It felt like a betrayal. Things at home got tense. My siblings and I were divided. One wanted to contest the will outright, to fight it in court and make sure Lisa and her kids got nothing. Another thought it would be better to just accept what had happened and move on, no matter how unfair it was. Before we could even agree on what to do, Lisa tried to reach out to me directly. She sent a message asking if we could talk things through like family. Lisa claimed she had never wanted things to escalate this far, but her actions, filing lawsuits and pushing for more inheritance, contradicted her words. I had no interest in hearing her out. The legal issues weren't even the worst part. A few days later, someone leaked the entire situation to social media. At first, I didn't even realize it was happening. Then suddenly, I was getting messages. People were talking about it in group chats. My mother's friends were calling her, checking in on her because they had seen it online. The story spread fast. My dad had another family and left them part of his estate. People who barely even knew us suddenly had opinions. Some thought my dad was a fraud. Others said Lisa and her kids deserved everything. And my mother? She was mortified. It didn't stop there. At work, I started noticing the looks, the subtle glances, the way conversations would shift when I walked into the room. A coworker made some offhand comment about how family drama is the worst while looking directly at me. I didn't even know how to respond. One person who didn't know about any of this beforehand was my cousin. She was furious. She had grown up with me, had spent every holiday with our family, and she had never known about Lisa or her kids. She immediately took my side and started digging. That's when we found the bank records. My cousin and I went through old statements and transactions, trying to figure out just how long my dad had been financially supporting Lisa. It wasn't just a few years. It was decades. There were payments going back to before I was even born. That was the final straw for my mother. She filed to contest the will, arguing that my father had misrepresented their finances in a way that could have been fraudulent. Lisa didn't take it lightly. She lawyered up fast. She wasn't going to let go of what she believed was rightfully hers. And just like that, we weren't just grieving a loss anymore. We were at war. After my mom officially contested the will, I cut contact with Lisa and her kids completely. They were strangers to me, and I wasn't about to pretend otherwise. Whatever relationship they had with my father was their business. I wasn't interested in playing some blended family fantasy. That decision wasn't popular with everyone. My siblings were divided. One of them thought we should at least hear Lisa and her kids out. The other was firmly on my side, saying they had no right to anything after how our dad lied to us. It turned into a full-blown argument at home, with voices raised and doors slammed. It felt like our family was being pulled apart from every angle. Meanwhile, my mother wasn't letting anything go. She hired a private investigator, determined to prove that my father had done something illegal. She wanted to find anything that could invalidate his financial decisions. It didn't take long for the investigator to start uncovering things. Turns out, my dad had more than just one secret account. He had several. Some were in his name, some were in fake business names, and one was directly linked to a completely separate company that we never knew existed. The record showed that this company had been funneling money to Lisa for years. That's when everything shifted. This wasn't just about an affair anymore. This was fraud. The lawyer immediately got to work, figuring out if we could use this against Lisa in court. If my dad had been hiding money through fake businesses, it could be grounds to freeze the accounts and contest the will even further. But before we could make any moves, more drama started unfolding. One morning at work, my boss pulled me aside. He looked uncomfortable, like he didn't want to have this conversation. He told me that all the public drama surrounding my family was starting to affect my reputation. People in my industry were talking about it. There were even whispers that I might not be focused enough for my position. It felt like I was being punished for my father's mistakes. Then came the Facebook post. Someone from Lisa's side, probably one of her kids, posted a long dramatic message online about how my family was selfish for trying to take away what was rightfully theirs. They painted my mom as some vindictive woman who was trying to rob them of their future. And of course, people in our community started sharing it. Some of the comments were brutal. Strangers, people who had no idea what actually happened, were calling us out, saying things like money makes people show their true colors, and his dad was just trying to do the right thing by both families. I barely had time to react before the legal battle escalated even further. Lisa's lawyer formally filed a motion demanding a larger share of the inheritance, arguing that my father had promised them long-term financial stability. They even had old emails and texts showing my dad talking about setting them up for life. As if that wasn't enough, my mother completely broke down during a legal meeting. It wasn't just about the money anymore, it was about the betrayal. 30 years of marriage, completely shattered. She started crying in front of our lawyer, saying she felt like she never really knew the man she married. The stress was destroying her, and the extended family wasn't helping. Some of them started picking sides. A few relatives thought my dad was just trying to take care of his responsibilities, saying that Lisa and her kids deserved something. Others were furious, saying he had scammed everyone and destroyed the family name. It felt like no one could agree on anything. Then, in the middle of all of this, I found a letter. It was sealed, tucked away in my dad's old office, hidden under a pile of papers. It had my name on it. It was from him. I stared at it for a long time. I wasn't sure if I even wanted to read it. Would it give me closure, or just make me angrier? Before I could decide, Lisa reached out again. She was desperate now. She wanted to meet in person, to make amends. She wanted to talk things through, to find a way for all of us to move forward together. That was the breaking point. I snapped. I told everyone, my siblings, my relatives, even my mother, that I was done. If they wanted to keep entertaining Lisa and her kids, they could. But I wasn't going to be a part of it. I blocked Lisa. I stopped answering messages from the relatives who wanted to mediate. I refused to engage with the Facebook drama, and then, out of frustration, I posted the whole story on Reddit. I didn't expect much. I just needed to vent. But the post exploded. Thousands of people weighed in. Most were on my side. Some were arguing in the comments, debating who was really in the wrong. Others shared their own stories about discovering family secrets after a parent's death. By the next morning, it had gone viral, and for days the letter sat unopened. I wasn't sure if I wanted to read it, or if it would just make me angrier. The idea that my father had left behind a final explanation felt more like a calculated move than a sincere act of closure. But after everything, Lisa's legal battle, the online fallout, my mother breaking down, I needed to know what he had to say. So one night, when the house was quiet, I sat down and opened it. His handwriting was rushed, almost sloppy, like he had written it in a hurry, knowing his time was running out. He started by saying he never meant for things to turn out this way, that he never planned to have a second family, but once it happened, he couldn't walk away. He wrote about being torn, about feeling trapped between two lives. It read like an excuse. He claimed he was always trying to do the right thing, balancing his responsibilities between two families, that he had wanted to tell us, but he was afraid of the fallout, that he had hoped it would all make sense one day. Then, a vague apology. No real regret, no accountability. Just I hope one day you'll understand. Understand what? That he was a liar? That he destroyed our family because he was too much of a coward to make a decision? I wanted to tear the letter apart right there. But then I saw the last paragraph. He had left something for me. A safety deposit box, under my name. Instructions on where to find it. The key, everything. At first I thought it might be another mess. More lies, more secrets. But I went anyway. Inside the deposit box were old financial records and handwritten notes. Among them was a single USB drive. When I plugged it in, I found a mix of legitimate business documents and suspiciously unrecorded transactions. It wasn't a smoking gun, but it raised more questions than answers. The USB contained financial records that hinted at hidden assets, but most of them were scattered across shell corporations. It was clear he had been planning something, but the full extent of his dealings remained unclear. He had been funneling millions between two families. It wasn't just support payments for Lisa and her kids. He had built a whole second business in secret, with hidden accounts that no one had uncovered yet. He said he had planned to come clean eventually, but by the time he thought about it seriously, it was too late. He begged me not to judge him too harshly, that he only ever wanted to protect everyone. I turned it off halfway through. This wasn't an apology. This was a man justifying every selfish decision he had ever made. I didn't tell Lisa, let her keep thinking she knew everything. Instead, I went straight to my uncle. When I showed him the files, he froze. He didn't even try to deny it. Turns out he already knew. Not just about Lisa, about everything. The secret business, the money laundering, the way my dad had spent years moving money between accounts, covering his tracks. The entire paternal side of my family knew. They had chosen to stay quiet, That was it. That was my breaking point. At the next family gathering, I snapped. I didn't care who was listening. I called them out. Every single one of them who had known and stayed silent. The people who had watched my mother fall apart at the funeral, who had whispered behind our backs instead of telling us the truth. Some tried to defend themselves, saying it wasn't their place to tell, that they had hoped he would do the right thing eventually. It didn't matter. I blocked them. Every single one of them who had enabled my father's double life. I was done. It didn't take long before Lisa made her next move. A lawsuit. She was officially suing my family for a larger share of my father's estate. The claim? That my dad had promised her and her kids financial security. And now that he was gone, we were trying to leave them with nothing. She wasn't just asking for the assets left to her in the will. She wanted more, a bigger share of his business, a portion of my mother's house, and additional funds from accounts she claimed were meant for her children's future. The lawsuit hit my mother hard. She had already been barely holding it together. But this broke her. A few nights after we were served, she collapsed. We rushed her to the hospital. The doctors said it was stress-related exhaustion. Too much pressure. Too much emotional strain. She needed to rest, to stay calm. But how could she? Lisa and her lawyer were already moving fast, pushing for emergency hearings to freeze assets, claiming financial hardship. My dad had left them property, but apparently that wasn't enough. They were making it sound like they were struggling to survive, when in reality, Lisa had been living just fine for years off the money he secretly funneled to her. Our lawyer was already working on it. He started digging deeper into financial loopholes that might prove Lisa wasn't actually entitled to as much as she was demanding. Then someone leaked court documents online. Suddenly the whole town knew about the lawsuit. The headlines made it even messier. Secret second family sues for bigger inheritance. Late businessman's hidden life sparks a court battle. People who had nothing to do with our family were weighing in online. Some were siding with Lisa, calling my mother bitter and saying my dad had just been providing for his kids. Others were defending us, pointing out that Lisa had no legal marriage to my father and had already received a portion of his estate. Lisa must have seen the backlash. Suddenly she shifted to damage control, publicly pleading for peace. In a social media post, she claimed that she never intended for this to be a legal battle, and that, as a mother, her only goal was to secure her children's future. I wasn't buying it. Neither was our lawyer. After weeks of financial investigation, we found a secret trust fund, one that Lisa conveniently forgot to mention in her lawsuit. My father had already set up a private account for her and her kids. It had been fully funded for years, more than enough to support them. Our legal team presented the evidence of hidden trusts, which forced Lisa's lawyers to rethink their strategy. While it didn't immediately end the case, it weakened their argument significantly. The judge ruled that her claims were grossly exaggerated. Her emergency request for more funds? Denied. Her demand for a larger inheritance? Dismissed. She was furious. Her kids, my so-called half-siblings, were just as angry. They called me selfish, saying I was taking away what was rightfully theirs. I blocked them all, but even when things should have been settling, the drama wasn't over. The public sympathy was starting to shift. More people learned about Lisa's hidden trust fund, and suddenly she wasn't the struggling widow anymore. She was a woman who lied in court to try and get more money. That's when the final betrayal happened. My own cousins switched sides. They agreed to testify for Lisa, claiming that my father had always intended for them to be financially equal to us. It didn't matter that there was no proof. The fact that a family member was now siding with Lisa made things even more humiliating for my mother. Lisa saw the writing on the wall. She tried to settle privately, offering to drop the case if we gave her a quiet payout. My mother wanted to consider it. She was exhausted and just wanted it all to be over. But I refused. Lisa had already gotten more than she deserved. She wasn't getting a single cent more. The final court ruling came a few weeks later. The judge officially ruled in our favor. Lisa's demands were denied. The lawsuit was over. Lisa broke down in court. I saw her crying as she walked out, but I felt nothing. The damage had already been done. The family was ruined. My mother's health had suffered, and my father's reputation was in the gutter. Then, out of nowhere, I got a message. It was from Lisa's oldest kid, my so-called half-sibling. I didn't ask for this either. I stared at the message for a long time. Then I put my phone down. I was done. No more legal battles. No more second family. I was walking away for good. With the lawsuit over, I thought things would finally calm down. The legal battle was done. Lisa had lost, and the court made it clear she wasn't getting anything beyond what my father had already left her. But just because the court ruled in our favor didn't mean the damage was undone. My mother was still recovering. The stress had taken a toll on her, and even though she tried to act like things were getting better, it was clear she wasn't the same. She wasn't eating much, barely sleeping, and any mention of my father sent her into silence. Then she collapsed again. I found her in the kitchen, gripping the counter, struggling to breathe. We rushed her to the hospital, and the doctors told us it was another stress-related episode. They warned that if she didn't start prioritizing her health, it could turn into something worse. That was the moment I realized just how much this entire mess had taken from us. While my mother was recovering, I started noticing something else. My father's reputation was completely destroyed. Once, he had been respected in our community. People saw him as a successful businessman, a family man. Now, he was just the guy who had a secret second family and got caught. His name was dragged through the mud, and the respect he once had was gone. Business partners distanced themselves. Friends who used to praise him stayed quiet. Even some family members, the ones who had defended him at first, were now pretending like they had never been close to him. It was like his entire legacy had collapsed overnight. Then my lawyer called me. A long-term investment my father had set up decades ago had just matured, and because of legal oversight, it had been left untouched. It wasn't an instant fortune, but it gave me financial security that I hadn't expected. It wasn't just a little money, it was life-changing money. At first I didn't know what to do with it, but the more I thought about it, the clearer the decision became. I donated a chunk of it to a charity for single mothers. It felt like the ultimate middle finger to my father's entire double life. He spent years lying, sneaking around, building up wealth in secret, and now, his money was going towards something he never would have expected. Not long after that, I heard through the grapevine that Lisa was struggling. She had been so sure she would win the lawsuit that she had kept spending money like she was about to get a massive payday. But when the ruling came down, and she realized there was nothing more coming, she had to start selling off assets, including her house. I didn't feel bad. Not after everything she put us through. She had a fully funded trust. She just wanted more. Now she was facing the consequences of her own greed. Then, something unexpected happened. My oldest half-sibling reached out again. Unlike last time, there was no anger, no accusations, just a simple request. They wanted to meet. For the first time, I actually considered it. So we met up in a quiet cafe. No lawyers, no family, just us. For the first few minutes, it was awkward. But then they started talking about how they had grown up wondering why our dad wasn't always there. About the empty promises he made to them, just like he had made to us. And for the first time, I saw it. They were just as lost in this mess as I was. They didn't ask for this. They didn't choose to be born into this disaster. Just like me, they were left cleaning up the fallout of our father's choices. By the time we left, we agreed to stay in touch. On my terms. Not as siblings, but as two people who had been lied to by the same man. When I told my mother about it, she didn't say much. Just asked me not to let my father's mistakes define my future. I promised her they wouldn't. A few weeks later, my mother and I went to visit my father's grave one last time. We didn't bring flowers. We didn't pray. We just stood there for a moment. Then, without saying a word, we turned and walked away. That was the real goodbye. After that, I started cutting the last ties. I blocked Lisa. I ignored the other half-siblings. I deactivated all my social media, sick of seeing the drama pop up every few weeks. Instead, I focused on real life. I finally started therapy, something I should have done from the beginning. There was too much to unpack. The betrayal, the anger, the years of lies, and I needed to process it all. And for the first time in months, I felt free. Not because we won the lawsuit, not because Lisa lost, but because I was finally done. My father's lies no longer controlled my life. I could finally move forward on my own terms. I thought it was over. The court ruled in our favor, the lawsuit was dismissed, and Lisa was forced to deal with the consequences of her own greed. I had cut ties with everyone on that side, ignored the half-siblings, and blocked Lisa for good. My mother was finally recovering, and for the first time in months, life was starting to feel normal again. Then, I got the call. An unknown number popped up on my phone. I let it go to voicemail, but when I listened, I recognized the voice immediately. Lisa's lawyer. She was trying one last time to claim more assets. The message was full of legal jargon, but the point was clear. Lisa still believed she deserved more. And if I wanted to avoid more legal battles, I should be willing to negotiate. I hung up. 2 days later, my family lawyer called. Lisa had officially filed an appeal against the court's ruling. She was trying to argue that new evidence had come to light, something about my dad's financial intentions. She was hoping to get another chance at grabbing more money. My mom didn't even react the way I expected. She just sighed, leaned back in her chair, and said, "Let them fight ghosts." She wasn't going through this again. She told our lawyer to handle it, but she refused to engage in another legal war. We had already won. Lisa was just grasping at straws. That's when the social media posts started again. Lisa's kids, the same ones who tried to guilt-trip me, posted a long dramatic rant about how my mother and I had stolen their inheritance and left them penniless. They painted my mom as a bitter, greedy widow who was hoarding all of my dad's wealth for herself. They claimed they had been wronged by the system, and that justice hadn't been served. And of course, people started sharing it. A distant relative, one of those nosy family members who never knew when to shut up, reshared the post saying that family should never fight over money and that everyone deserved their fair share. Word spread through distant relatives and old acquaintances. A few people from town caught wind of the lawsuit, but it wasn't the viral spectacle Lisa had hoped for. Even so, it made daily life uncomfortable. He laughed it off, but I could tell people were still whispering. Even with my father gone, his lies were still haunting me. In therapy, I told my therapist about it all. She reminded me that none of this was my fault. My dad created this mess. I was just dealing with the fallout. She asked me a simple question: what would happen if you just stopped paying attention? So I did. I ignored the posts. I didn't respond. I didn't engage. And then, my lawyer called again. Lisa's appeal? Completely baseless. She had no new evidence. The original ruling was final. The judge immediately dismissed the case without even hearing arguments. Lisa had officially lost. Again. Then, in a last pathetic move, Lisa emailed me directly. She wrote some long speech about our father's wishes, how he wanted us to be a family, how he would have wanted me to step up and take care of my half-siblings. It was so ridiculous, I actually laughed. Take care of them? They were strangers. And they had spent months attacking me online, calling me greedy, selfish, heartless, but now they wanted me to honor our father's legacy. I didn't respond. Then, my lawyer found something interesting. Turns out, Lisa's kids had been contradicting themselves online. In some posts, they claimed they were left with nothing. In others, they talked about how much their father had secretly set aside for them. That alone destroyed any last chance Lisa had. With their own words exposing their lies, they had killed their own case. After that, the meltdown began. Lisa and her kids went nuclear online. They called me heartless. They called my mother a thief. They said we ruined their lives. I ignored all of it. Then, I cut off the last ties. I blocked everyone connected to Lisa. No more messages, no more updates, no more nonsense. And for the first time in a long time, my mom smiled. She looked at me and said, "We finally won." And just like that, it was over. A year has passed since the lawsuit ended. I haven't spoken to Lisa, her kids, or anyone who sided with them. No messages, no calls, no updates. It's like they don't exist anymore. And for the first time in a long time, life feels normal. My mother is finally healing. The stress that used to weigh on her is gone. She's been traveling more, spending time with old friends, and for the first time in years, she actually looks happy. My father's betrayal doesn't haunt her anymore. She's free. And I've moved forward too. At work I got a promotion. It was unexpected, but after everything that happened, I had thrown myself into my career. Partly as a distraction, partly to prove to myself that my father's mistakes wouldn't define me. Then, through the grapevine, I heard something interesting. Lisa had to move into a smaller home. After losing the lawsuit, she had spent all her money, assuming she'd win and get more. When that didn't happen, she couldn't keep up the same lifestyle. Her kids, my half-siblings, have been completely silent online. No more rants, no more posts about justice. It looks like they finally accepted that it's over. I started reconnecting with relatives, the ones who stood by us. At first, it was awkward. So many of them had been just as blindsided as we were. But over time, the relationships started to feel genuine again. Then, something I didn't expect happened. The cousin who sided with Lisa reached out. They admitted they were wrong, that they had believed Lisa's lies and thought they were standing up for the right thing. They asked for forgiveness. I was skeptical, but I listened. They seemed genuinely remorseful, and after everything I'd been through, I realized I wasn't angry anymore. The resentment, the bitterness, it was fading. Therapy helped. It took time, but I finally let go of the anger. I stopped feeling like I had to prove anything. My father's mistakes weren't mine, and because I was finally in a better place, I did something I never thought I'd be ready for. I started dating again. At first it was strange. I had spent so long feeling burned by family betrayal that trusting someone new felt almost impossible. But I met someone who had nothing to do with any of it, and for the first time I felt like I could actually move forward. Meanwhile, my mother made a big decision. She started renovating the house. Not just small changes, a full transformation. New floors, new walls, new furniture. It wasn't just a remodel, it was a symbol. The house was hers now, not a place filled with my father's lies. She turned it into her dream home. And in a way that felt like the biggest victory of all. We also started a new tradition. Father's Day used to be painful, a reminder of the man we lost, then a reminder of the man he actually was. So now, we celebrate our mother instead. She was the one who was loyal. She was the one who stayed by us. One day I realized something. I hadn't thought about my father in months. His grip on my life was gone. Then it happened. I was at a grocery store checking out when I saw one of my half-siblings. We locked eyes. Neither of us said anything. No confrontation, no drama, just silence. And in that moment I knew I was truly done. No anger, no resentment, no pain. I walked away without looking back. Because my life is my own now. And for the first time in a long time, I know exactly where I'm going. I thought I had finally put everything behind me. The lawsuit was over, my mother was healing, and the second family had gone silent. Life was finally moving forward. Then, out of nowhere, an unexpected email showed up in my inbox. It was from one of my father's old business friends, someone who had stayed completely quiet through all the drama. The subject line was simple: "There's something you need to know." The message was brief. Apparently, my father had one last secret, a third hidden account that no one knew about. Not my mother, not Lisa, not even his own lawyer. It was tucked away under a dummy corporation, one that hadn't been touched in years. The email included a link to a paper trail, financial documents, offshore transactions, and one final hidden stash of money. I didn't know what to make of it. I went through the records, trying to make sense of it all. This wasn't just extra money, this was a fortune. And the biggest irony, Lisa and her kids never knew about it either. For all her scheming, for all the lawsuits, the social media meltdowns, the public attacks, she had been left in the dark too. My father hadn't planned on taking care of anyone. Not his first family. Not his second. Not even himself. He was hoarding money, stockpiling wealth like he was planning to vanish one day. I had a decision to make. If I revealed this money, it could trigger another legal battle. Lisa might come back, claiming she had a right to it. Even though the courts had already ruled in my favor, this kind of discovery could drag me back into the nightmare I had just escaped. Or I could keep it quiet. I told my mother about it. She barely reacted. She just shook her head and said, "We don't need that blood money." And she was right. So I made my decision. I donated every cent of it. I found charities that supported single mothers, education programs, and shelters for women and children in need. All the things my father never cared about. Every penny of his secret empire went to something that actually mattered. It was the ultimate irony. After that, my mother and I decided to leave town for a while. We took a trip to a place we had never been before. Somewhere far away from the memories, the drama, the weight of everything that had happened. One day, while we were sitting on a quiet beach, I pulled out my phone and looked at my father's contact. I had never been able to delete his number. For some reason I kept it, even though I knew he would never answer. But now, it was time. I deleted it. For the first time it felt final. It wasn't about winning the lawsuit. It wasn't about getting justice. It was about finally letting go. And I wasn't the only one moving forward. My mother started dating again. I never thought I'd see the day, but she was actually happy. She was living again, proving that betrayal doesn't define your future. And me, I was in a healthy relationship for the first time in years. Something real. Something built on trust. The one thing my father had never understood. Lisa and her kids. They disappeared. It had been over a year since I last heard from them. No more messages. No more lawsuits. No more drama. I suspected they had finally moved on too. One evening, as I watched the sun set over the ocean, I thought back to everything that had happened. The funeral, the betrayal, the lawsuits, the chaos, but none of it mattered anymore, because in the end, I had won. Not just in court, not just financially, but in the biggest way possible. I was free.